One of the most championed values in our culture is undoubtedly freedom. And perhaps we don't spend very often or very much time thinking about what it is or it feels like or it looks like to be actually free. I'm sure if I asked most of you, you would say that, well, it would be free from interference and folks bothering me or telling me what to do so that I can live life according to my own purposes and values and sort of thing. And that is okay as far as it goes, but it is a very modern idea of freedom. It hasn't existed for a long time. And buried in the Exodus story, we have the fact that that's not the whole picture. That freedom there, quite often, if it just stops at being nobody's telling me what to do or interfering, that for some reason, the way our world works is what we tend to end up doing then is becoming attached and sometimes even enslaved to something or someone else. Maybe even our own ideals of what it is to be free, and that becomes something that consumes everything else in our lives. And in many ways, Exodus is a deep, deep study in what freedom actually is and looks like, and gives us the biblical picture and ultimately what the gospel says freedom looks like. Now, it's going to say, spoiler alert, for what the whole conclusion of the book is going to be, that freedom is being free to worship a God that loves us and that is interested in our freedom. And it's going to be unapologetic about making that claim as the gospel is. But what I hope is that as we go through it, that'll become evident and apparent to you that actually is the, if you like, the zenith of freedom, is to be free to worship God. Now, call this message Hope for the Oppressed. Why? Well, I think that there's a few ways that folks are oppressed in this story, and it's not just about having to make bricks and mortar. Exodus comes, as you know, in your Bibles after Genesis, and in many ways it is a continuation of the story that began there. A good way to think about Genesis and Exodus is they are the beginning of the story. So they tell us about how God made the world and how God populated it with humanity, but then also what his purpose and his ideal was for humanity, how the world was supposed to function and lead to human flourishing, and how that got off track and went off the trail. And you and I in our lives can think of many ways in which human flourishing, we are not experiencing it. We experience frustration and bondage even and difficulty. And it has something to say about, in a timeless way, this is how things got off track, and this is how they continue cyclically to get off track. Now, the writer's very subtle and careful in the way that they do this. But even you would have, as Callum read for us, these are the names of the sons of Israel. That's actually a formula. So Genesis is divided into about 5 different, not chapter headings, they were added much later for our English Bibles, but in the original Hebrew it's divided into about 5 big sections, and they always start with these words. These are the names, these are the generations. And so what the writer has done at the beginning of Exodus is said, these are the names, so that you as the reader and the original audience are clued into, the story that we began being told in Genesis is still going on. And it's still relevant. Now, what was that story to the people of God specifically? Well, it was God has given you a good creation and world and has blessed you with it. And he's also promised you blessing. And he's promised a certain family of the world blessing, which is through which the kind of restored goodness of the creation is going to come. That was Abraham, remember? Now, what did God promise Abraham? He promised him that he would dwell in a beautiful and plentiful land. He promised him that he would have more seed and progeny than the stars of the sky or the sand of the seashore. And he also promised him his own connection and blessing. He promised, I'll be with you. I will be your God. You will be my people. And so if that's the big story of blessing that began at creation, it went off track, as we know, in the garden, and it got derailed, and then God decided to do a rescue operation with Abraham and said, I'm going to bless you, and those blessings and this fruitfulness that I promised at the start of creation, it's going to come back through you. When we read, these are the generations, we think, okay, the story's not over. And we know that Joseph had been massively blessed in the land of Egypt. He'd been prime minister. He'd helped administer a great rescue operation through the famine. And so we pick up the story there, and we're going to find out what's going to happen to this great story of blessing and curse. What's going to happen to humanity? They've been given this amazing mandate by God to populate the world, to fill it with the goodness of God, to be connected to God above, to live in harmony with one another. What's going to happen to that? Now, it's going to take a dark turn initially, but that freedom to be with God and to be in harmony with others, we're going to see that there's continued hope for it through Exodus. So I want to look at a couple of things, 3 things actually, from the couple of passages we're looking at today. Firstly, that fear and suspicion of others in this world is natural. Secondly, that slavery, being enslaved, is actually natural. Now, when I say that, I don't mean that it is good. I'm not celebrating it, just in case this gets clipped and taken badly out of context since we're putting it online. I do not mean slavery is natural in the sense that it is good or something we should aspire to. What I mean is, spiritually and physically, runs natural in human hearts, as history shows, to enslave others or sometimes even to become enslaved ourselves. That's what I mean by that. And thirdly and lastly, that salvation is supernatural. That fear is natural, that slavery is natural, and that salvation is supernatural. Fear and suspicion of others is natural. That's where we're going to start. So we're introduced to the sons of Israel who went down with Jacob, and then we read that whole generation died out, and the Israelites were expanding, and they were having children and multiplied. Then there's a new king and a new Pharaoh who knows nothing about the generation of Joseph and how much he helped the nation out. He's got no connection to that old Pharaoh. And he looks out one day and he says, look, these Israelites have become too numerous. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous. And if a war breaks out, we'll join our enemies and fight against us. So what's going on there? This is part of the problem, that Pharaoh has enormous power. And how did he get that power? And this is so subtle, but when I saw it this week, I thought, that is amazing. What happened when there was a great famine and Joseph helped make that nation buoyant enough to survive through a famine? How did they do it? Well, it was actually a bit like what we had to do during COVID. The people had to at first temporarily surrender some of their liberties and their freedoms. They had to surrender some of the portions of their land and of their grain for the national effort, if you like. A bit like we've done in wartime with rationing and digging for victory and all of that. Okay? Now they did that. And that can be a temporary thing, but what happened, or what seems to happen, is that created an unbroken line of power. That means that this Pharaoh now had inherited this sort of tyrannical level of power that was unchallenged and unbroken. And when there isn't a good or a wise person like Joseph on the scene anymore to regulate that, who has a kind of conscience before God, then this man, and we know this from ancient Egypt, thinks he is God. And the amount of power he has amassed through probably what was initially a response to an emergency, but just carried on, is unparalleled, and there's no challenge to it. And so he looks out, and what's he the most worried about? He's the most worried about losing that power. He's the most worried about a group of outsiders, if you like, taking it from him. And it is the most natural thing for him in the world to be fearful and suspicious of this great group of people. But notice how quickly he makes a leap in logic and starts to project. We must deal shrewdly, because if a war breaks out, they will join their enemies, fight against us and leave the country. So what evidence does he have that that is going to happen, that they will turn against him? So far, if we look at the evidence, so far this people, this different ethnicity, if you like, have come down. Through them, they have helped stave off a catastrophic famine and mass deaths. They have worked fruitfully and productively. There's no indication that there's any tension between the people groups at this point. And so what is the Pharaoh doing? He is projecting onto them his fears, his insecurities. And he is, if you like, fortune-telling the future with no good evidence, and saying, this is what's going to happen. I need to act in case that happens. And so rather than either going with the facts on the ground, the evidence, or indeed the goodness of the relationship that they've enjoyed, he's acting with fear and suspicion. Have you ever done that? Do you ever do that? Do you know people that do that? Can you see how that is actually, unfortunately, a very natural response that we see to go about our world in? Look at the success of nearly any campaign that has tried to other a group of people. Look at Joseph Goebbels' propaganda machine during the Second World War against Jewish people. It came exactly from this playbook. Look at those people over there and start to use your imagination to think about the destruction and the devastation they will cause to our nation if we continue to let them grow and breed. And I chose that example very deliberately because you can trace roots of anti-Semitism all the way back to these ancient stories. And so the Jews have faced this over and over again, but they're not the only people group. So often we find this in our world. So often the rhetoric in our own country around other nationalities and people groups and immigration, it feeds on this same thing. Imagine what they could do if they became more powerful and rose up. Do you see how this is an old story, but this is still happening? And the problem is that the fear and the suspicion and all that projection, it seems natural because it speaks to something about people's self-preservation, about how they want to protect themselves, and sometimes even a good desire to protect their families. But the target is based in something that's made up. It's a narrative that's threaded. Goebbels was brilliant at what he did because he was able to tell a story. He was able to tell an alternative story about Germany. And even the language, I love the way, and I hope I'm excited about this, and I hope you become excited about it, because the way the writer connects this to the original story in Genesis is so skillful. Because Pharaoh says, come, we must deal shrewdly with them. Now, the Hebrew word for shrewdly is the exact same word that's used to describe the snake in Genesis 3. The snake that entered the garden was shrewd or crafty. And what did the snake say? Did God really say that he's got your best interests at heart and that if you follow him, you'll have a good and fruitful life? No. He just doesn't want you to be like him, starting to put fear and suspicion in the hearts of Adam and Eve to get them to question God and the good order that he had set and to go, oh, maybe if we take this into our own hands, then things will go better. If we act out of fear and suspicion that God doesn't have our best interests at heart. And we're meant to see that Pharaoh is not the new incarnation of the devil or the snake. It's much more subtle than that. It's that this thread that runs through it, that interrupts God's good creation and inserts itself into it to ask and try to weave a different narrative to the one of goodness that he has established with humanity. It continues to have disastrous consequences because all it needs to do is take that craftiness to take a root and to question God, and it leads to fear and suspicion. Why? Because it separates people from the God who gave them this good order and this good mandate. And so that fear and suspicion, unfortunately, ever since the garden, becomes completely natural because people are disconnected from others and from God. And secondly then, slavery follows as actually a really natural consequence of that fear and suspicion and distrust of God, if you like. So, verse 11, they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor. And they built Pithom and Ramesses as store cities for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. This happened and continues to happen in the world because ultimately this isn't that Pharaoh needed this labor force and that he badly needed these store cities built and that it was a tight labor market and he didn't have enough workers. It's not about any of that. The author has let us know it's actually about his fear, suspicion, and his sense of losing control. And so what he does is, in order to preempt him losing any power, control, or authority, he wholesale enslaves an entire population and people group, and he comes with chains in order that they might do this, because the psychological part of it is probably just as bad, if not worse, than the physical hard labor. The physical labor sounds awful, but what's the message that it gives? We are more powerful than you. We are dominant over you. Don't even think about trying to do anything to upset our political order. Don't think about trying to live in any kind of freedom or even an equitable way compared to your Egyptian neighbors. You are lesser than us as a people group, and we'll keep bringing the chains so that you continue to know that. You see, all of those messages are being reinforced. And so that power and that domination is the natural outgrowth of their fear and their suspicion. Because what else can they do? They're terrified. It's in the text. It said that the Egyptians became terrified. This panic and alarm continues to spread from Pharaoh all the way down through their society. And so that gets everybody on board going, these people are terrifying. They might rise up against us one day. We need to keep our boot on their necks. You see? And that system of trying to crush and quash any kind of, preemptively, any kind of movement by a people has continued. All societies that have had to fight for their liberation have had to fight against this dynamic that the powerful oppress the weak, that it's in their interest to do so to keep their power going. We even see this sometimes in modern political parties and systems where any kind of question or dissent is completely quashed or thrown out, or or cults work like this. You're ostracized or you're othered if you ever dare to ask a question, because they are determined to remain in power. And so you have to remain an unthinking, uncritical slave, if you like, if you want to maintain your position. But it goes deeper than that. Because Exodus is as much about the slavery of the human soul as it is about people making bricks and mortar and chains. Do you see? And we're going to see this later, because when Moses says to let my people go, which you all know happens, why does he say it? He says, let my people go that we may go and worship our God in the wilderness. And so it is not just about the fact that it's a terrible thing to be in chains and slavery, and that is wrong, and it's injustice and oppression. It is about that, and also the fact that freedom looks like being free to actually worship God. And that is the real problem. And this enslavement is a situation where they can't get out, but it also speaks to the fact that they're not free to worship God. And this is where that enslavement applies to us, because Pharaoh doesn't always look like a tyrannical ruler in our modern world and in our lives. Because the experience of slavery can be found in nearly anything. And it's something that we're kind of almost asleep to, because in modernity, we think that we are so free and we're making so many of our own choices, and this has probably never been truer since the explosion of technology. We are, in many ways, enslaved to our devices and the systems that keep us hooked in. You can take the obvious ones, if you like, the amount of people today that are enslaved to pornography or to gambling or to alcohol or whatever it is. Those are the obvious ones, but they're on the surface, because underneath that is a heart that continues to be in bondage to something, and it's not actually set free for a good purpose by a good God. The main connection that we're meant to see is that in that kind of dynamic and relationship, it's a complete breakdown of relationship. You see, God gave a good creation and world where he would be a benevolent ruler, God, king, whatever you would call it. He even gives them the choice. You can obey me or not obey me. But nothing else that becomes an enslaving relationship in our world is like that. Because in every other instance, the master cares absolutely nothing for the slave. That image that you see of the Egyptian masters driving the Hebrews harder and harder with no thought for their humanity, that's actually what all enslavement looks like. When somebody's freedom and choice is removed and whatever they are attached to and enslaved to and they can't get out of, that master, if you like, the abuser, and that can be a thing or a compulsion or a behavior or a person, it doesn't care anything for the person, for you. It's not interested in your well-being unless it is a good God who has made you, and the flourishing of your heart is their chief and primary interest. So this is still a problem that goes on and that is relevant to us, because that sense of slavery, whether to rule over others and quash any questioning and to try and just maintain our power, or for our heart to wander around. John Calvin said that the human heart is a factory that makes idols. We tend to find things that we will attach ourselves to, hoping and believing that they will bring us freedom, peace, security, finally bring us some happiness, and they come up empty. And that's what enslavement can look like, even if nobody is putting chains on us. Sometimes we put the chains on ourselves. Sometimes we sign ourselves up to things that keep us in bondage. And we're going to see more and more of that as we go into the book, because the fear and suspicion of others is natural, slavery is natural, but finally, salvation, I would put to you, is the thing that breaks into the story and is from outward and from above. It's supernatural. There's a child born, and in between these bits that Callum read for us, part of Pharaoh's manic obsession and paranoia has meant that he orders a genocide, and he asks for all the Hebrew boys, which is going to be the fighting strength, if you like, for them to be thrown in the Nile and to be killed, in order to try and make sure that this people is completely cut off from any power and emasculated. And he's ordering the midwives to make sure that they take part in this, but there's this baby born, a Levite, and mother hides him. She can hide him no longer. She gets a papyrus basket for him, coated it with tar and pitch, and she placed the child and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. And then Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile, and she saw the basket and sent her slaves to get it, and she opened it up and saw the baby and was crying, and she felt sorry for him. Now, we all know, you saw the picture, we all know this story from Sunday school. I want you to get something of the power of this from a salvation point of view. Because what the mother does is she gets a basket, and the tar and the pitch, does that remind you of another biblical story? That's what the ark was covered in, okay? That was Genesis 6. You see, the author is trying to get us to remember that there are flashpoints where God breaks into the cycle of evil, of destruction, of enslaved human hearts, and he keeps bringing a bit of hope and salvation. And so she covers it in tar and pitch. Now, what's the Nile in this time and in this place and in this story, in this situation? The Nile is a place of death, because it's where the babies are being thrown. The flood waters, similarly, where in many ways the natural consequences of a world that was quite literally going to hell in a handbasket, and the waters often means death in the Old Testament. It engulfed everyone in death. It was the water of, if you like, of decreation. It was decreating God's good creation because of the evil in the world. Here we've got the absolute rampant wickedness of the Pharaoh and his people committing genocide, and into that very water goes Moses in this basket of life. And he is going to become the hope of this people for liberation. And how does that happen? Because Pharaoh's daughter sees him and has compassion on him. So think about what Pharaoh is trying to achieve. He is deeply insecure, he's paranoid, and he's trying to control the population and trying to wipe out a certain people group, which has never worked for the Jewish people and has never worked in Christianity. This happened in early Christianity too. They tried to wipe them out and it didn't work. Here we are. He tries to do that, And his exact efforts to do that lead to his own daughter and his own family becoming part of the process of salvation for this people that he is trying to destroy. What did the Apostle Peter say about the cross of Jesus? You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. That was the story of Joseph as well. His brothers meant evil towards him, but God turned it around for good. Sometimes people always ask me, why is there evil and suffering in the world? How can we reconcile that with a good God? I don't know exactly, but I keep seeing flashes of this kind of thing where despite the eviling and suffering in the world, so often what we see in the biblical story, what we see in our world is the worst that humanity can imagine. God takes that and through love and compassion, he turns that around for the good and the hope and the salvation of people. This is the gospel in the Old Testament and in a nutshell. That despite the fear and the suspicion that people have of others and how that turns into oppression, wickedness, slavery, and yes, even genocide, that God is not doing nothing about that. That God is sometimes and very often quietly working behind the scenes. Jesus looked like an absolute abject failure by almost any standards of his contemporary revolutionaries because he died and was killed as a common criminal. But just like Moses was dropped in a basket into what could only communicate death, a river where babies were being killed, Jesus went to the ultimate agent of torture, went through the worst imaginable thing that we all fear at some level, death itself and the blackness of it. And he went through it, just like Moses went through the waters of the Nile. Jesus Christ went through death and what looked like humanity's worst evil and oppression, killing the Son of God himself. He rose from that, which we're celebrating in Eastertide, to actually break the power of it, to actually cancel out the hold that death and sin had on his people. Amidst the blackness and the darkness and the difficulty of Calvary comes the hope of life, comes the forgiveness of sin, comes the reconciliation between God and people. Ultimately, in that river of death was placed a baby that is going to be the hope of this nation, that is going to offer and provide them salvation, that is going to lead them out of oppression and bring them freedom and ultimately hope that they'll be free to actually worship God and no longer be enslaved by not only the Egyptians, but the folly and the wickedness of their own hearts. And they'll be free to actually live the life that God always intended for them. The hope for us today is whether we find ourselves, whether it's the fear and suspicion in our hearts that at times seems to overtake us, or whether it is we know that we have an enslaved heart in some way, that is never the end of the story, that the gospel doesn't end with the tragic human condition that we all find ourselves in. It has a God who sometimes works in a quiet and an unassuming way, very often in the background, bringing salvation and hope to people and then extending that to them anew. It is never the end of the story with God because the gospel always produces life and hope, even in unlikely circumstances, and he will even draw us and take us safely, even through death itself, because Jesus faced that and went through it in order to liberate his people. May God bless his word to us this morning. Amen.